Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg, and I'm co-director of the Center on the Future of War. Many of you are familiar with the center, but very briefly, we're a partnership between ASU and New America, a DC-based think tank. We're now starting our 7th year in operation, and we're really thrilled to have tonight two extraordinary scholars and people with just amazing lived experience for our third event in our fall speaker series, or our fall series, because our last event was really the Future Security Forum that many of you who are on our email list know about. That was actually 4 days online this year. So tonight's event is the War for Gaul, how Julius Caesar's ideas on strategy can help us face contemporary challenges. And we have here the author. I'm going to just show you all. This is the book. It's a beautiful cover, and it's quite an amazing book by James O'Donnell, who is the ASU University Librarian and was previously the Provost, as well as a University Professor at Georgetown University. This is his new book. It's a new translation of one of the classics, and he is a renowned classicist. And we're fortunate to have, as a discussant, or it'll really be a conversation, one of the core faculty members of our center, retired Lieutenant General Robert Schmidle. Robert Schmidle is a professor of practice with us. He was the first Deputy Commander of Cyber Command. He helped stand up the operation. And he's a combat pilot with over 4,700 logged hours in tactical fighters. And he also has, interestingly, a PhD from Georgetown in a program that Professor O'Donnell helped create and shepherd into its existence. So we're really thrilled to have an extraordinary group of colleagues here. And we'll go right into Professor O'Donnell speaking a little bit about the book, and then Professor Schmidle will speak for a little while. There'll be a conversation, and we will take questions and answers later in the event. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Dan. Howdy, everybody, and good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here and to spend some time talking about one of my favorite books. Caesar's Gallic War, The War for Gaul, is a heck of a book. I translated it because I love the book, and I wanted to make it come alive. I wanted it to come out of the schoolroom where it has lingered for a couple of thousand years. If you write a book long enough ago and well enough, people are going to make a school book out of you, and that's not what this one should be. It's vivid, it's exciting, it's dramatic, it's beautifully written. Caesar was a great politician, but he also had a lot of pride in his literary style. And I tried to give him an English style that was as terse and sharp and crisp and penetrating as only he could make it. But I also know that this book is, by my standards, the very best book ever written by a very bad man, setting out to tell us with no qualm of conscience whatsoever just how bad he was and what he did. Caesar went to Gaul to govern a small province. He decided to conquer the rest of Gaul. He decided to make his name, his fame, and especially his fortune, there was a lot of money to be made in this, by heading north from Provence, which was his province, and conquering the rest of Gaul. Probably about 1 million people died in the 8 years he was on campaign. That's a high price to pay for fame, glory, and empire. So I tried to both translate the book, make it exciting and readable, but also make it possible for you to think, you the reader to think, about what it means to read a book like this. Because a book about war, I'll be interested to hear what General Schmidle has to say, but a book about war to me is never a book just about soldiers. This one has lots of soldiers, and they're marching up and down Gaul, and they're throwing things at each other, and they're heading for cover, and they're launching sieges. But war isn't just about soldiers. War is something politicians do with soldiers. A lot more is going on when you read a war story. And I wanted to try to tell the story that way with my introductions and commentaries and notes around the translation. We know Caesar, when he was on campaign, wasn't just a general. Okay, brilliant general, but he was in constant touch back in Rome. The man who stood up the cyber command for the United States Army should know that Caesar had a special code he used to send messages back and forth to Rome. And he had relays of secretaries running back and forth, keeping him in the news letting him know what was really going on. Every winter, he went into winter quarters and usually went back to northern Italy. And we know, for example, in one year when he did that, he got his rivals and partners Pompey and Crassus to sneak out of Rome. Cicero was gobsmacked a couple of months later when he found out what had gone on, to come up to see him in Lucca, near Pisa, just in northern Italy, so they could cut a new bargain after 5 years of partnership to divide up the whole world among themselves. They succeeded in doing that. Crassus marched off to die in combat in Persia. Pompey went back to Rome, and Caesar got another 5 years in Gaul. Good politician at work. But we also know that in one summer, he did dramatic campaigns into Germany and into Britain, places no Roman soldier had gone before. He describes the fancy bridge he had to build to get across the Rhine River. Remarkable thing, though, is those two campaigns in one summer led to nothing. They were sort of search and reconnaissance missions, followed by heading back home for the winter. Why does he do that? Why did he tell that story? Well, in the same year that he was going to Germany and Britain, where no general had gone before, Pompey, his great rival, was opening the Theater of Pompey back in Rome in the Campus Martius. The Theater of Pompey was, I don't know, Hudson Yards, the Mall of America, the biggest thing anybody had ever built in Rome. Caesar, off there in Gaul, wanted his own media splash when his story got back to Rome that winter, to show that Pompey was resting on his laurels and building theaters. Caesar was out there conquering the world. So one of the most famous things about this book is that it's written in the third person. Julius Caesar, Gaius Julius Caesar the General, refers to Gaius Julius Caesar the General as Caesar constantly. He slips about twice into the first person, but he's always talking about Caesar. Why was he doing that? Because every year he wrote one book, one chapter, call it, of the Gallic War, sent it back to Rome for public readings. And when this book was being read out loud in public, he wanted you to know about Roman armies defeating Gauls, but he wanted to make sure you knew who was in charge of those armies. So the reader, proclaiming his text out loud, had to keep saying the name Caesar over and over again. Caesar did this, Caesar did that. Well, given that kind of involvement, given that kind of political connection, I wanted to try to make it possible for the people who read this translation to see the book the way the original readers would have seen it. Great war story, Caesar, mighty general, great politician, Caesar. Wanted you to pay attention to that. I wanted you to know what was in Caesar's mind and what was in his audience's mind when he was confining himself to telling you a story about soldiers marching up and down and besieging each other and throwing heavy blunt objects in each other's directions. This is a book that leaves us with questions when we're done. And I tried to point those questions in the way I presented it. Really, the biggest question is, what is war really about? How much of it is politics? How much of it is strategy? How much of it is just sheer brutality for brutality's sake? And do the normal standards of ethics apply at all? Am I being fair to Caesar when I say he's a bad man for getting 1 million people dead? Wars are places where people get dead. Do all the normal standards and rules of ethics just cease to apply when people go off to fight in a war? Do we keep a few sort of Geneva Convention standards around the edges to make ourselves feel good, but turn the world in front of us into a free fire zone just for killing? And how should we feel about that? How do we make the trade-offs we have to make to understand the cost that war brings in human life and human treasure? And of course, I also talk a little bit about the profit in human treasure that came back to Caesar. Selling tens of thousands of Gauls into slavery put a lot of money in his pocket. And when Caesar came back to Rome, he built the Forum of Julius Caesar just to compete with that silly Pompey and his theater. So the last question I pose is, when we tell a story about war like this, and we read it and we enjoy it, are we becoming complicit in the fighting of the war itself? Are we part of the problem because we enjoy a book like this so much? Should we really enjoy it as much as we do? I'm genuinely not sure. I tried to put the book together in a way that helped me think about that, but would help my readers think about it without me dictating to them what was really right and what was really wrong. But I want my readers to think about it. I think that's where I'm going to leave my introductory comments for now. Bob, over to you. Thank you for being here. I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, Jim, thanks. And that was a great summary, and I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. One of the things that I thought I would focus in on that Daniel had mentioned earlier is the relationship between what you wrote about in Caesar's Gallic Wars, the way you translated it, and the way we look at warfare today in the 21st century, the early 21st century. And there's a couple of things that I think that's really jumped out at me when I read them. One is you, in the introduction, a very complete and lengthy and very, very useful introduction to the book, you talk about the language that you use. And the word that I thought of was sparse. The phrase you use is fiercely austere. And I would suggest that is a very, very important part of the way this book comes across, because the language, as we know from folks like Wittgenstein, as he famously said, this language is the limits of my world are the limits of my language, and it defines the way we think about warfare. So for you to take and to translate, and what I really enjoyed about that is you translated it was kind of like just the facts. Let's get this thing down. Let's trim everything off this language, because you, I think, accurately wanted to portray the brutality of warfare and the way that Caesar had executed it without glorifying it. And so I think that was very, very effective. The language that we use today when we talk about war is much more sanitized. You know, we talk about projecting power. We talk about being offensively minded. We talk about integrating fires and things. We use words that don't have a direct impact, that don't portray that kind of brutality. And I think that is a transition that we are making in the way that we view warfare. You mentioned that about that this is a book more than just about soldiers. You know, to paraphrase Clausewitz, you know, war is politics by another means, and in fact it is. And it's, you know, we are trying to compel the enemy, if you will, to do whatever, to do our will. The way that Caesar thought that he needed to compel the enemy was by killing large numbers of them, obviously, and enslaving the rest. Although there are some parallels, you know, during the Second World War, the British had a campaign at night. They bombed the cities in Germany, and the gentleman that was in charge of that, his name was Bomber Harris, his nickname. He's the only one that there are no statues to Bomber Harris anywhere in the UK. So it's almost like they felt like they needed to do something, but nobody really wanted to talk about that indiscriminate kind of killing. The next thing that I noticed in here is especially in it was the 6th and 7th commentaries. You talk about or he talks about Lavinius and deception. You know, and deception is another interesting thing. Deception, it seems to me, when I read through this, was something that you didn't have to tell Lavinius or Caesar, you need to deceive the enemy. It was just the way they thought about conflict and warfare. Today, we tend to do things a little differently because we haven't had to deceive anybody for so many years, because we've been the biggest and strongest bear in the forest. And so we would put together, and we still put together, operational plans. And then at the end of it, somebody in the room says, holy cow, we need a deception plan. And we go back and add that on instead of baking it in from the beginning. So I thought that you're bringing that forward, and the way that you described you had Lavinius describe the deception plan. It was just very sparse but very, very effective. And as you know, Sun Tzu has, was famously said a lot of things. One of them is that deception is, everything in warfare is based on deception. The other thing that you mentioned in there that I think is not quite as may not be quite as predominant today is the concept of physical courage. You know, Caesar is there. He's in the front lines. He's fighting with the soldier. He is in the midst of that. And there is, while it is probably there's nothing that's more highly prized in the American military than physical courage, it's not something that is necessarily exhibited by very senior officers because of the distance that they are from the battlefield nowadays, whereas in Caesar's days, that was not the case. And there's a comment that you made at the beginning in the introduction about civilized peoples and atrocities. And I think it's important for us to remember that as civilized as we may think we are just not that far away from being in a position to suddenly find ourselves exhibiting that kind of behavior, whether it's in the case of the Germans in the Second World War, or there are many other examples, some of which unfortunately reside in the United States, and the capability of humans to be utterly barbaric to other humans. I don't think that's changed much. And the interesting thing is that the barbarians in Gaul were fearful of the civilized Romans. And so, and I would imagine there's probably some parallels like that in other places of the world today as they look at the Americans at times. And the last thing that I would mention before we get into the Q&A here is this concept of victory. And you start to talk about it at the beginning in your introduction. And Caesar is going to, while not directly address it, at least from what I could tell, constantly alluding to the fact that there has been, he has, quote, been victorious. That concept, to me, seems to be rather naive. Victory, like defeat, is another episode in warfare, and it depends on the perspective, your perspective about that. You know, the Germany of 1945 is very different than the Germany of 1995, for example. So sometimes, whether, you know, this notion of victory or not, we still today, I think, in the American military tend to equate victory with military prowess. And in fact, you know, your comment about the political side of it is wholly the case. And the last quote that I would leave you with, there was an Army colonel many years ago named Harry Summers, who wrote a book in the 1970s called On Strategy. And it was meant to be a takeoff on war, and Clausewitz's On War. It's not anywhere near the same academic or philosophic basis, but that was what he called the book. So when they first opened up Vietnam in the 80s, he was on one of the initial tours. He was on one of the initial parties that went over there to talk to the Vietnamese. And he met with General Giap, who was the general. And at one point he says to Giap, he said, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." And Giap says to him, "You know, Colonel, you're right, and that's completely irrelevant." So we conflate the two sometimes, but those are my initial framing comments, James. And or Jim, I can ask you. I mean, let's start with the language piece. Could you respond to that, to your how you feel about, I know you made a very conscious decision to use the language the way you did. And what did you have in mind when you were framing the book that way?
Well, thank you, first of all, for focusing on that. But Caesar wrote it that way. And in literary circles in Rome at that time, there was a kind of competition of styles. Cicero was the more florid, the more elaborate. And Caesar was the guy who was on the side of the tough guys. I made a point, I haven't read Hemingway in decades, and I made a point of not looking at Hemingway while I was doing this. Because there is a kind of Hemingway-esque quality.
Very much so. Yeah.
And what's funny in modern translations is translators always want to explain things and make things really clear. And so you will have seen my footnote in which I told you how many words of English most translators use per word of Latin. And I'm very proud that I cut it down. I made it as lean and mean as I could, because I was working for the literary effect that he would have on his original audience. Most modern translations and people talking about Caesar have maps of Gaul. They have plans of battlefields. They have diagrams of weapons. They have pictures of the bridge. And they're trying to explain all of this in elaborate detail for moderns. Okay, Caesar's original readers didn't have a map of Gaul. They just heard about these places. There's a famous article about Caesar's Gallic War called Stumbling Through Gaul.
Mm-hmm.
One of the differences in Caesar's time to your time is he had no good maps.
Yeah.
He had people describing to him what the countryside would look like when he went over that ridge, which is not quite the same thing as Google Maps or the topographic maps that you
Mm-hmm.
grew up on back in your early days. And so they lived in a more constrained way of seeing the world. And I was trying to capture what he was doing and the impact he was trying to have with as few words, and you're right, as tough words as he could. Caesar does not go for euphemism. No, sir.
You know, I'm wondering if the brutality with which he executed that campaign was a function of that was the only thing he knew, or that was the only truly effective way to be able to subdue a population like that. And as we are now in the 20th century and even in the 21st century, with the exception of the two large world wars, we sometimes feel compelled to operate with more restraint. And it's because at the end of the day, the ability of one army or one country to coerce another into doing something it might not want to do is in the eyes of the people that are trying to be coerced, and not in the eyes of those that are trying to coerce them. And so you got, did you, as you were reading through all that and you were, I mean, how would you want readers to react to some of those scenes?
Well, part of this is that the war story itself is the dramatic story.
Mm-hmm.
It makes a good film. There's
Mm-hmm.
lots of war movies that are about, landing on D-Day or
Mm-hmm.
Guadalcanal or what have you. I'm not sure there are any famous books or movies about war that start on the deck of the Missouri at the end of World War II, that start at the Paris Peace Conference.
Mm-hmm.
But World War II, you well know, didn't end in 1945.
Mm-hmm.
A whole lot of people got dead, being moved around Europe, being purged
Mm-hmm.
in one form or another, starving, whatever. The war took a long time to die down. The Iraq War of 2003 is similarly famous.
Mm-hmm.
It ended in whatever limited number of days it was, but there's important senses in which that war isn't over yet. I think we were spoiled as a generation by the way World War II did finally die down completely, and we became friends with Germans and Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually unnatural. Tacitus writes his history of the Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius becomes emperor, 63 years after Caesar leaves Gaul.
Mm-hmm.
And the first story in the reign of Tiberius is revolt in Gaul. It isn't quite done yet.
Yeah.
And it really took the Romans 100 years to get complete, tranquil, undisrupted calm in the places that they went. So when you were talking about the brutality of it, I think that was the showmanship of trying to subdue a population and keep it subdued. But yeah, most war stories are told from one side or the other, and you know who to root for.
Mm-hmm.
When you're reading this book, you're rooting for Caesar.
Mm-hmm.
But take the position of a Gaul in this. They're sitting there minding their own business with a perfectly civilized country of small states. And all of a sudden, this outside army comes bashing through, killing left and right. And here we are 2,000 later. You even called them, I heard you say it, you called them barbarians. And that's a sign of the partisanship you've been lined up for. And that's the ambivalence of this, that the book doesn't want you to see, but I think if you're going to make sense of the book, you have to see how hard the book wants to work to make you not see
Yeah.
problematic.
So I think that the barbarians were, I mean, that was the way the Romans referred to them, obviously, and
Although, can I interrupt for a second?
Good.
Caesar does not use the word barbarian of his opponents in this book more than a couple of times. He could have used it a whole bunch more. And his name for the communities that he fought, his Latin word is not tribe. We always hear of Gallic tribes. It's civitas, which is a perfectly good Roman word for a perfectly civilized community. He actually showed more respect than you might expect for the folks he was dealing with, even as he was getting 1 million of them dead.
So one of the things that that we've just been talking about is trying to subdue populations, right? And what that entails. Just a couple of quick historical examples. At one point, Napoleon actually himself has to go to Spain. He's given his brother the ownership of Spain, and there's a huge insurrection there, and he literally himself has to go to Spain with more and more troops in order to be able to put this down when he's trying to invade the rest of Europe. So he's kind of distracted. When Hitler is on his way into Moscow or into Russia, the total number eventually gets to 18 divisions that he had to peel off to go into what's now what was then Yugoslavia, to put down a rebellion of the Croats in Yugoslavia, or the what do you call it, the Slavs in Yugoslavia. So it seems to me that we tend to not give that type of resistance as much emphasis when we think in more traditional terms. Now, there's a quote in the book here that I'd like you to respond to in that regard. So Caesar is going to include the speech of there you go. And there's a great phrase in there where he says, "Men offering themselves voluntarily to death are easier to find than men who endure suffering calmly." So Caesar had to put that quote in there. He made a point of doing that and including that. Why do you suppose he, do you think he was driving?
Well, we talk about that. That speech by a Gallic leader is the longest speech in the Gallic War. To his credit, Caesar does not report him giving speeches very much. Yeah. Or if he does, it's a sentence or so of, and then Caesar, rounded up the troops and they went storming off into battle, something like that. And that line is one that people look at and say, yeah, did a Gallic chieftain actually say that? Or did a Roman general who had read Greek philosophers decide that was a good thing for a Gallic chieftain to say?
That's my question. I mean, it's because you could, as we're talking about resistance, you could make the case that Caesar is setting the plate here, so to speak, that a good Roman needs to be able to calmly resist the whatever is coming upon him. And I mean, he may be looking down the road at that point towards what he knows is going to be a campaign when he is no longer in Gaul to assume complete control.
That comes a bit later in the work, as does the Great Revolt under Vercingetorix in Book 7. Mm-hmm. And I think by the time he got there are some changes in style because he was writing this one chapter a year as the events rolled out. I think he was deliberately dramatizing the power and the intelligence of his enemy. You could say generous, but it's also designed to make him look even better. Caesar is a general who can defeat even these guys, and these guys are, these guys are tough. They're smart.
There's no question about it. He, especially as I began to pick it up in Book 7, Caesar, seems to be much more focused on creating the other that is going to bring more glory onto him. That he needs that as he especially in the part about the revolts and the way that in which you argue, as have many others, that came very close to being the end of Caesar's reign there. So,
but it's also closer to the point when he's getting ready to go back to Italy.
Yeah.
To try to seize command himself. And so he's thinking even more about how the impact this storytelling makes on an audience that's going to just wants him to come and march and triumph through the city of Rome.
Yeah.
To bolster his campaign.
So you mentioned earlier, about the coding and encrypting the messages that he was sending. When you look at sort of the contemporary national security environment today and the influences of technology, et cetera, as you were reading or writing this book, were there things that were occurring to you that had to do with the way we were looking at conflict, at the way that we might be fighting it, at the influence of technology? We don't think of them as being very technical, but actually technologically, they did have some rather advanced ways of killing each other, which seems to be a human trait. We generally get pretty good at that. Did you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, Caesar's success in Gaul was the wealth and discipline of the Romans. His soldiers had been trained, had been schooled. They had discipline, they had tactics, they had proven capacity for doing things efficiently, where the Gauls were frankly more amateurish. And so you get an early iteration of stories in which a relatively small number, half a dozen legions of Romans, could take on tens of thousands of others and defeat them. I think what really strikes me most, though, and we won't know in our lifetimes, is just how much of a change is happening now. I was struck when you commented a minute ago about courage. It isn't just that generals had to be more courageous back in 55 BC, but common soldiers who got up in the morning, bolted on inadequate armor, and went out there and bashed heads with other common soldiers. Needed a kind of crazy courage. And I know enough of the modern literature, S.L.A. Marshall's famous discussion of how many soldiers in World War II actually fired their weapons in the direction of an enemy soldier.
Yeah.
And how many were just kind of, pointing in some direction and firing. What I've been struck by the last 15, 20 years is how much of the damage is done in warfare by people who aren't anywhere near risk themselves. Those drone pilots in a bunker someplace hundreds of miles away are the most vicious and most effective killers. And they're eating a cheeseburger while they do it. And they're going back to play war video games that evening in their barracks with no sense of themselves being genuinely at risk. That's a huge disruption to what has, for all the history of mankind up through maybe Gulf War I, has been the experience of fighting. And that's one that 50 years from now, you're going to look back at and say the world is very different. I'm always struck when I read about Vietnam or World War II by the things that went on that just couldn't possibly happen nowadays. I'm sure we have now seen the last tank battle in history. It just doesn't make sense to put Rommel's forces driving across North Africa against Montgomery anymore, because the air power and I suppose if you had tanks coming at you, what you'd really want to do now is hack into their operating system and disable them before they got to you. From your bunker 3,000 miles away, and just leave them sitting there as sitting ducks. That's what a tank is designed for now.
So your observation about the drone pilots is interesting for a number of reasons. One of them is back a number of years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was a very, very animated series of discussions in the Pentagon about whether or not to give drone pilots medals, air medals. And eventually the answer was no, because of what you just mentioned. How can you give someone a medal for bravery in combat if they themselves are not subject to any kind of danger? You know that I had some rather animated conversations with a former Secretary of Defense about whether or not we were in the midst of changing the nature of war. You know, the U.S. military, one of the grand cliches that we repeat over and over again from the time we go to the War College until the time we retire is that the character of war changes, but the nature of war is enduring. I don't know that that's necessarily true, because the nature of this war, of Caesar's wars, was the nature of that war was much more personal and much more brutal than the nature of a conflict. And I got it that the nature and character are kind of interchangeable here, but it just seems to me that that what we are seeing that. And I think over the next 50 years, as we begin to see the inclusion of artificial intelligence, especially when we get into things like general AI, which people in the Pentagon are pushing back on for obvious reasons, but that seems to me that genie's out of the bottle, and we're not going to be able to put that back in again. And to think that we're going to be able to distinguish between different kinds of algorithmic agents going forward is to deny what we know about machine learning, et cetera, and about generally.
So let's remember the context. I'd say it's up till about the Civil War. You might have a different opinion. When people volunteered to go off and be soldiers and get killed, because in fact, being a soldier was a better life than being a starving peasant. And because they figured if they were with a good general, they'd probably survive. They'd probably get their retirement after 20 years and live happily ever after, and it was a better deal. Somewhere between, I mark it that the Civil War is when private soldiers began to care about whether they survived or not, and other people began to care about whether they survived. And I've read some good books about that. It's really then mid-20th century that you get to a different calculus of advantage of who gets to be a soldier, who doesn't get to be a soldier, what do they get out of it. And once you start negotiating about benefits and educational benefits and healthcare benefits and so forth, you're not dealing with Caesar's soldiers anymore, and there's consequences of that a generation later, I think, which we're beginning to see now.
Well, the other thing that's happening there too, Jim, is as it becomes less and less obvious why you would want to volunteer to be a soldier, because you know, so if we go back to the big inflection point, of course, is Napoleon's Grand Armée, right? It's the huge volunteerism that occurs after the end of the Revolution. But again, that begins to peter out, and we get to be more and more professional. During the Civil War, the Southern Army routinely marched without boots. I mean, the famous story, which is true, about Gettysburg, the meeting engagement on the Chambersburg Pike was because that one of the battalions of Southern soldiers had gone off in search of shoes, because they were marching barefoot and had been since for a month or however it is. So what happens though, one of the things that occurs is as it becomes less evident that you can increase your social or your financial status by becoming a soldier, we have to create a culture in which we begin to glorify more and more that service as a soldier. I would suspect that the soldiers that fought under Caesar were under no illusions about the glory of the gloriousness of going to war. They were going, they knew it in all of its brutality, but they did it for another reason. Yet now, and you see, you know, so if you join, you know, and this began when we did away with the draft, right? So if you join, you get these benefits and these benefits and these benefits. And we are paying people bonuses sometimes of $100,000 a year to stick around and go fly airplanes because they're doing other things. So there's a couple of things that have happened here in the you know, in the course of this professionalization of the military. And at one point in the book, you talk a little bit about the professionalism of the soldiers, and that they are led by amateurish sorts of, and that's might not be such a stretch, because one of the things that I think the American military is concerned about is becoming so professional that the civilian leadership, and they do that because of the concerns about the way the civilian leadership will use the military, that you have a danger of this civil military divide in a way that we really probably haven't anticipated, because it's kind of snuck up on us. And you can see it in the way that we hold general officers up on a pedestal and say, these guys are, well, okay, but you know, that's not a wholly altruistic notion, I would say.
Okay, but this is our generation in a way. You're making me see that World War II was kind of the apex of the curve of patriotic warfighting, fighting for your country, not fighting because you were drafted, not just because you were drafted, not fighting because it was the life for you, but because you went off out of a sense of obligation and a sense of loyalty to the country that you were attached to. And that feels, ever since then, we've worried about that.
Yeah.
But that feels like it ought to be the norm. But in fact, historically, that's not the norm. That's not why.
No. You have events like 9/11, which causes a large number of people to suddenly raise their hands. But then, you know, as things in Iraq go the way they went, you know, and people start coming back without limbs, it's suddenly not quite such an exciting time. Yep. So Jim, I think that at this point we've got a little bit of time left. We probably ought to go to the Q&As, and sure. I think Daniel is ready to jump in here. We got the timing right on that, Daniel?
Beautiful. Yeah. So we've gotten some questions for those of you out there in the audience. You can drop your questions into the Q&A box. I'll just read them from there. And our first question is from a really wonderful colleague, Stephanie Lindquist. I'm just going to read it because it's kind of a longer question, so I'll read it in its entirety. We now look upon Caesar's wars with horror based on his enslavement of conquered peoples, slaughter of tribes, etc. But who can we look to at the time who offers a more civilized leader at the time Caesar was writing? Marcus Aurelius, for example. How can we position Caesar as evil if few other leaders at that time could be held to have met our modern standards of civilization? Steven Pinker argues that we have moved away from violence over the course of human development. Can we situate Caesar and understand him in his own cultural and imperial milieu without sacrificing our own current values?
Can't think of good parallels from his time. I think I might differentiate between war fighting and unnecessary war fighting, but even there I might be picking at a distinction that isn't really there. The way societies got wealthy, the way they built capital cities, was by going out and defeating other people in war. That's how they got slaves. That was a sign of wealth and power and connectedness. And you can make an argument that people didn't know there was an alternative. And maybe our modern poignance is that we know, or we think there is an alternative. And so we can be high-minded and ethical about these things. But I guess I'm back to the scene, is it in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where the big brute of a guy challenges Paul Newman to a knife fight. And Paul Newman says, okay, but wait a minute, we got to talk about the rules first. And the big brute of a guy lets his guard down and says, well, what? Whoever heard of rules in a knife fight? At which point Paul Newman stabs him in the stomach and kills him and says, exactly. That's a dramatization of the fact that I think as a species, we're still ambivalent about what rules apply, when they apply, and where they apply. I mean, I guess I will say in ancient times, Roman soldiers, Roman armies knew there were plenty of places where they didn't behave the way they did on a battlefield, and had some ideas about when they could and when they would and when they should. They may be different from ours, but they were there. I think we're at least entitled to evaluate the choices they made and compare them to our own choices, and not simply take them at face value.
So I think one of the things that we should keep in mind, I think, and it's a great question Stephanie asked, is the way that we execute in combat is a function of the battles that have gone before then and the activities that occur. And so here's an example. When we traditionally go into places like into cities, and we're going to try to, like Ramadi, Fallujah, or Hue City. Hue City is a great example in Vietnam. It was a cultural city. The U.S. went in there, the U.S. Marines went in there from 5th Battalion, and they initially did not allow them to use indirect fires, artillery or aviation. They wanted to, the leadership wanted to preserve the city. And once, however, after day 2, when the U.S. casualties got to such an extent, they then just let the dogs of war loose on them. The same thing has occurred in other places. In the Second World War, there are many examples, and I actually published on this, of the German and British pilots behaving very civilly to each other in combat, like not shooting down other pilots in their parachutes, et cetera, et cetera. I found nothing like that in the Pacific. That war was much more brutally executed because of the way the other, if you will, the impression, whether it's because of cultural biases or whatever, but the way that the others are fighting them. So it's difficult for us, I think. I wouldn't take it completely out of context. I think that we are capable of those kinds of that kind of brutality today, as civilized as we think we are, if we were in a position where there were the kinds of casualties. You know, we have been second guessing the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but only when we were after we had defeated the Japanese. I mean, so there's just a number of things that are at work here about the way that we decide that we are going to execute in combat. I mean, it's, you know, the fire bombings of Tokyo, by all accounts, killed as many or more people than the explosions at Hiroshima. So, I don't know that we've lost that part of us even today.
A question here from a student in the online MA Global Security. Jun Kaima, thank you for the discussion. Caesar mentions that few of his key officers except for Titus Lavinius, who later defected to Pompey and attempted to kill him, something shared by several others who crossed the Rubicon. Is there any foreshadowing in the translation process where Caesar is weighing the words he chose to ensure those who served him are not cited in ways that could be problematic or embarrassing for Caesar in the future?
Caesar was a very political guy, but I don't think he was able to see that far. Labienus was famously disloyal in the civil war that followed, and you cannot see it coming in the books we have. And that's one of the testimonies to the contemporary account, where you're capturing the confidence of the leader who's on a roll at the time he's writing these things. And it's interesting to know the 8th book of the Gallic War is actually written several years later by one of Caesar's lieutenants. That's part of the assurance that this stuff is really contemporary with the events as they unroll. It's one of the things that gives the book a lot of value and currency, that you really are getting the story, you know, in the first take.
Another question here from another student from the online MA, Hans Kulnotes. Despite all societal respect for the military, where is America's Julius Caesar? We have Eric Prince, but he's no JC. Can we expect one on the horizon? Would we want one on the horizon?
That's actually, I think, the question. So there's a book that was written a number of years ago. I think it was written by William Manchester. I could be wrong. Called The American Caesar, and it was the story of Douglas MacArthur. And I don't think that if if you believe that this great experiment of ours in self-governance is to be successful, that's having a Caesar is obviously not what we would be looking for. And that relationship with MacArthur, though, is really instructive for a couple of reasons. One of which is that once MacArthur, when he made the decisions to do what he did, and Truman then relieved him, that was the end of it. I mean, there was obviously, he went and testified, the great famous speech about old soldiers, don't die, they just fade away, et cetera, et cetera. But there was no attempt on his part. There was no coup, even though the Republicans wanted him to run for president. He did not. So it's, that is telling of the culture that that this issue of civilian control of the military is something that we all, I think, believe is a foundation to our democracy. So,
I was thinking of my third grade science project. In third grade, I did a science project to prove that salt water was more buoyant than fresh water. And this involved two bowls. And to float in them, I had, because I'm growing up on an army base in New Mexico, 3.5-inch tall plastic statues of great generals of World War II. MacArthur was one, Alfred Grunther, Omar Bradley, and of course, Ike. And as you were talking, Bob, it struck me that Ike was the un-MacArthur. He worked for MacArthur when he was younger, but Ike came back and was elected president, but nobody read that as a military coup, as the advancement of military leadership by other means, partly because Ike was not a MacArthur kind of general. He was a modern general away from the front, but fully in command. And he was, I think, one of our most successful presidents. The other fraction of this that comes to mind is I'm thinking of movies that have been made about great modern generals. And the only two that come to my mind are, of course, Patton, who was a little more like MacArthur than like Eisenhower. And there's one from the late 1950s, early 60s, The Desert Fox, about Rommel. And Rommel himself was an ambiguous character. Who was a loyal professional who didn't really go Nazi for all that he was the most successful general across North Africa that they ever had. But yeah, we have so far anyway, knock on wood, been immune to that kind of heroization. And Bob, I guess I will say it's a credit to your generation that if you say some names of your colleagues from the 90s and the aughts, I will recognize them, but they're not looming figures on the American scene. And that's congratulations to the profession, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's something that we spend a lot of time in the War College, which we go through after 05, Lieutenant Colonel Command, and before you go on to do joint tours and other things. But the War College, there's a lot of discussion about civil-military relationships and what they have been, what they ought to be, how they are. You go back to the Civil War and you find that many of the generals there were political appointees, and that, so that there's always a fine line between professionalism and the professionalism of the General Officer Corps or the staffs and the civilian leadership. And you find that I think the most effective civilian leadership, whether it's in the person of Lincoln, who takes it upon himself to understand the strategy and the operational stuff as well as some of his senior generals do. And that, I think, is one of the things that we sometimes have a difficult time with, is that there's a sense that the senior military folks need to understand the political leadership. And depending on what time of the year it is, it's not always the case that the senior political leadership spends as much time trying to understand the culture and the decision-making processes, and the fact that they're from two very different cultures. In the military, you can be summarily dismissed for adultery. You know, in the civilian side of America, that's not the case. And so, you know, we like to tell ourselves that we are a slice of Americana, and that we are just like the general population. But the fact of the matter is, we're probably not. Caesar's soldiers, I don't know, you might make an argument that they were more like a slice of the population, not necessarily a general.
I think the soldiers were, the officers were by and large amateurs.
Yeah.
Young men on the rise, punching their ticket, whatever. Yeah. And it's amazing they did as well as they did. It was, as not infrequently, the grizzled non-coms who were responsible for whipping those soldiers into shape and getting them down the field. Roman centurions won a lot more wars than Roman generals did.
So I have a question for both of you, but starting with Jim. I mean, it's an exceptionally readable book, and I've reviewed a few of the other translations which are not as readable, which gets to some of your points about the translation process. But beyond just the readability of your translation, which is so excellent, you reference in your introduction, you begin talking about how Cormac McCarthy might be the right voice in the sense of this conflict. Yeah. And then you end very interestingly with some excerpts from, I guess you would call them relevant texts, I'm not sure, where the first one is from Joseph Conrad. And my question to you is, do you view this work by Julius Caesar as a work of literature? And then, and if so, why, and what does that mean? And then for both of you, what's the right way to represent war? To what degree do we turn to literature? What's the right mechanism? And what are the right words and terminologies we need to have a deeper understanding of that core human experience?
Well, big question, but I would say there certainly is a literature of war and a serious literature of war, but it's a place where writers are usually thinking about more than just what it's like to be a soldier on a battlefield. I mean, War and Peace is out there somewhere at the limit case of that, but a lot of Conrad goes in that direction. And remember, Conrad's Heart of Darkness was turned into Apocalypse Now as a film, which was among other things with its limitations, a way of thinking about Vietnam in the early 1980s when we were still really, as a culture, pretty messed up and confused and just not sure what we had done in that and what we had gotten out of that experience. War is a place to find human beings pushed to their limit, pushing themselves to the limit, and facing facts of human existence that we don't face in everyday life. And so there are some great ways to write about it. I think this book is quite successful as one of them, for all my reservations about Mr. Caesar as politician and general himself. Bob?
Daniel, so I think one of the things about the book that I find compelling in that regard is that, in my experience, the literature of war is more relevant. There are different things that are relevant to you at different stages. So when we were getting ready to start Desert Storm, I was a flight lead for the biggest Marine strike of the war the first night, and in getting ready to do that with all 54 airplanes that we took north that night, I was immersed in everything I could get my hands on about how pilots in particular had approached combat, whether it was in the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam. What I was trying to understand was what to expect out of people that first night. And one of the things that kept coming back again and again and again in everything that I read, especially in the reports of Vietnam, we lost more airplanes due to accidents than we did to enemy fire. And so that told me something about the way that people were going to think and what happens when you turn into a brainstem, when people start shooting at you. Now that is different than, so as I continued to stay in the Marine Corps, the things that I was reading became more and more, they were at different levels. And it was, whether it was Clausewitz and trying to understand the theory of war, or whether it was more about strategy. And I don't know whether or not I could have, whether you can truly understand this at the strategic level if you haven't understood it at the tactical level. And but the fact of the matter is that good literature, you know, Stephen Crane, The Red Badge of Courage. If you read that book, it's an extraordinary expose of combat and of what men feel like under fire. Yet Stephen Crane was never shot at a day in his life, never been in a uniform, never been in combat. So there's something very basic and primal about the way that we deal with existential threats, we as humans do, and in the books, there are times when Caesar is talking about rallying the troops, what it takes to see a general out there that's trying to bring the troops, to trying to get them to turn and go back into combat as opposed to running away. So I guess the literature is there, and I think that reading the literature is as important, if not more important, than reading the facts of the campaigns, because at the end of the day, it still is an evolution that takes humankind to the ultimate level, because your existence is at effort or at risk. And Jim, you mentioned in the beginning, you said war is mad, I think, but unnatural. I would just offer that maybe it's not so unnatural, but it is mad. So the way that we try to understand how people think and feel under that, you know, there's a series of books called Lee's Lieutenants, right? And written by Freeman. And when I was going through the basic school as a second lieutenant, we had folks that were there with us that were reading the book and then kind of going out and trying to see how all these tactical things happened. And when I read through the volumes, I said, my God, this isn't really about fighting. This is about the relationships between Lee and his leaders. It's about the relationships of men that are trying, with obviously a very hard Southern spin on it. But so I think that the literature has a lot to offer. Literature does, and it depends on the level and where you're at, and that we just ought to have people seek whatever level that is. But it has to be done in addition to reading about the facts of what happened. And I think that's what's really fascinating about this book and about Caesar's writings at Gaul, is that he goes from the very basic tactical level to the grand strategic as the emperor, or soon to be emperor of Rome. And that's an interesting dichotomy there. So.
Beautifully said. Thank you.
Any final comments, Jim, before we end our event for the evening?
I'm going to leave it with where Bob left it. I thought that was very well put.
Well, thank you. It was really extraordinary. Thank you so much for speaking with all of us tonight. Everybody out there in the audience, thank you for spending the evening with us. You know, a round of applause, if that's possible, in the Zoom world. We'll do our best. Really briefly, we have our next event in the fall speaker series. It will be myself speaking with my co-director of the center, Peter Bergen. It's called COVID as a Hinge Event and the Implications for U.S. Security. It's next Wednesday, October 14th from 10 to 11 in the morning. For those of you on the email list, of course, you'll get a notification. And again, thank you so much, Jim and Bob, for your insights. It was really wonderful.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks. Yeah.